Strong racial identity is often described as protective, but what if it also carries a measurable physiological cost? In today's episode, Dr. Tony Brown and I unpack evidence linking racial identity to allostatic load, the body's cumulative wear and tear. We explore what this reveals about the lived experience of racism in America and why the environments we navigate matter. Dr. Tony Brown, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Really excited to be here with you today, Chris.
Yeah, to get started, can you tell the audience your position at Rice and a little bit about just what you research broadly?
Sure. I'm a distinguished professor in the Department of Sociology at Rice, and I have an interesting kind of way of thinking about my research. So I tell people all the time that I study racism, anti-Blackness, and white supremacy. What's unusual is I think people see me as a health researcher, and I have no problem with that because I think that's a part of it. But because I study these bigger things, I also have to study health, wealth, education, incarceration, and space. Because to me, if I'm going to talk about these bigger systems, I have to have more outcomes than just health. But I'm excited to think about the work I do on health because I think it's innovative because I start from a very different kind of position regarding what things matter on the independent variable side.
Makes sense. So I was digging into your presentation titled Digging Blackness in One's Grave.
That's a nice title, Chris.
It's a bold metaphor. What does it mean? And what's the core argument you want listeners to hold on to?
So the core argument is that our society is organized in a way where some people are given or are born into a space where they have higher value simply because they belong to one racial group and not another. And that feels really unfair because you can't change your racial group. It'd be great to be randomly assigned to race at birth. That'd be good. I'd go back and try it again as a white guy. But then we also know in some ways what sustains communities, Black communities and other communities, is their connections to each other, their connections to history, their connections to the ancestors, the connection to social movements that have been transformative of the United States and beyond. And so racial identity is really central, I think, to the Black experience. So the title Digging Blackness in Your Grave is really this difficult way of thinking about how something that's protective can also be harmful. And the gist of the paper is this finding that I'm imagining when it's published is going to upset a lot of cards. People aren't going to be happy with this finding. And the finding is essentially that the more racially identified you are, the higher your level of biochemical dysregulation.
So when you say racial identity, you aren't just checking a box for Black and white.
No.
You're using a scale. What exactly are you measuring there? What does it mean for someone to have high racial identity versus lower racial identity?
Right. That's a fantastic question. Let me tell you why. Often when we do disparities work, we put everybody who checks the box Black in the Black box, everybody who checks the box white in the white box. But if race is a sincere fiction, a social construction, it's a way in which we've imagined differences that don't exist on a biological level, then it makes no sense for us to use that variable that way. And in fact, if you unpack it, there are certainly Black people who feel very strongly about being Black and those who don't feel strongly at all. And the same with whites. There are whites who are anti-racist and they practice it every day like you. And then there are whites who belong to white supremacy organizations. And we put all those people together when we do the research we do that's categorical. So when I think about racial identity, I'm thinking about a concept out of a social psych called centrality. It's the degree to which your identity matters to you. You feel connected to your identity. It's a central part of how you see yourself. So for Black people in the United States, racial identity has been essential through decades and generations of exclusion. The one thing Black people had was connections to each other, right? And segregation fostered that, right?
Sure.
And so you could see how those kinds of connections to each other and having your identity be centrally connected to Blackness would be a good thing. You're not welcome in white society. You need this other way of being connected.
And that sort of brings me to, from my understanding of prior research, both in this domain and in the broader social psychological literature on identity, strong racial identity is supposed to protect mental health, right? But you found something a little different.
Right.
Unpack that.
Yeah, so this is why I'm probably going to lose some friends when this study gets published, because who would think racial identity would not be protective given how we theorize about identity in social science? Our connections ethnically, our connections religiously, all the identity axes we have, those identities mean something to us. They're important to us. So why would having one be a problem? Well, I'm hoping I'll regain some friends when I say it's not racial identity that's the problem. It's being racially identified in a society that is fundamentally racist, right? If the society is oriented toward maintaining white privilege, maintaining white supremacy, if it's oriented around anti-blackness, if you have people publicly saying we need to minimize the way we talk about slavery, if you have people publicly saying DEI is not what we need to be doing because the playing field's even, but you have all this evidence that it's not, then in some ways you are orienting toward diminishing even further someone's core sense of self and who they are. So it's not racial identity that's the problem. Why I like this paper is it shows in some ways anything could be problematic. Anything that we do that we think could be very protective could be problematically if structurally we're set up in a situation where that identity, that role occupancy is problematic, right? Mm-hmm. So being a mother is a great thing until all of a sudden mothers can't both be workers and mothers, right? So structurally we have these problems.
Sure.
But the same thing is true, I think, with racial identity here. I think people should be able to express their identity. I think people who are marginalized need this to feel connected to each other. So in that way, I don't want people to have less racial identity. I want us to think about a space, a nation. I want us to think about a place where society is oriented toward accepting people for who they are and maybe leveling the playing field for who we could be, right? If my identity causes me to have biochemical or biological dysregulation, it suggests that something's not wrong with me, but something's fundamentally wrong with the space I have to be in.
The space you have to be in. So your argument's not that black identity is inherently harmful. It's that racism in racialized environments can make that consciousness costly. Is that right?
Absolutely. And so one of the really fascinating findings in the paper was if you take racial identity and you cut it into quartiles, that would mean you have 25% of people in each group, say a low group, 2 medium groups, and a high group. What's fascinating about that is there's no difference between allostatic load for whites and those blacks who are in the lowest quartile. In other words, people like health disparities are durable, no way to get around them. And if we just think about who's actually identified, we find there are some spaces where there are no disparities. Mm-hmm. Black people who are detached from their blackness actually aren't sick.
And how's their mental health?
Yeah, so this is a physical health process, a paper we're looking at. The mental health is really interesting too, because as you know, if you're talking about any of the indicators from psychiatric disorders to symptoms, there are often cases where blacks report lower levels, right? But the problem with that fundamentally is the same problem. We're categorizing people. We're saying everybody who checks this box is this. If we were to do the same paper, and I would love to with mental health, I imagine we find there are some cases where racial identity is protective and some cases where it's not.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So in this paper in particular, you measured allostatic load using biomarkers. Can you just give a gist of what you mean by allostatic load and how you measured it? Because that's your marker, objective marker of physical health.
Right. So just to be clear, I've gotten into biomarkers only recently, in part because of some funding imperatives and thinking more carefully about how to assess health. But allostatic load comes out of work that suggests that obviously there's systems in the body, right? Some are inflammatory, some are endocrine. There's all these systems, right? And we have markers of dysfunction across all these symptoms. And so all allostatic load does is basically just count up the number of systems where you might have some dysfunctions, right? You can think about that in terms of circulatory and blood pressure. You could think about it in terms of inflammation, although we didn't have inflammation, right, in this study. And you could give a scale that would go from, say, 1 to 10 or 0 to 10. 0 would be you have no dysregulation across any systems, and 10 or 11 being you have complete dysregulation. So when you look at this graph in the paper, it's horrifying. These Black respondents are really sick a lot. And so it's really hard to think through how we begin to fix this, because these aren't easy problems to fix because you're dysregulated across multiple systems.
No, that makes sense. So it's an objective biomarker. It's sort of an amalgamation of different physical health indexes that is prognostic of people's overall physical health.
Absolutely.
I mean, the one thing that seems nice about that to me is that it's sort of it's not that it's better or worse than self-report, but it gives you an insight into sort of the system in a different way that sort of kind of can override what someone's sort of mental health processes are saying or doing.
Right. And I want to say I still believe in self-report. I'm a big advocate of self-report. I think you know your body really well. But I also know that in combination potentially with these biomarkers, you get better information. Knowing how someone feels and then being able to classify it with regard to these kinds of measures, I think is important.
Makes sense. So you test a remarkable range of explanations to see if the sickness was caused, I'm going to call it sickness, but the biological dysregulation was caused by some other, what we may call third variable influence, right? Yeah. I'm seeing sort of education, skin pigment. Can you break that down a little bit for me and sort of all the things you were looking at to try to do a little detective work on sort of why this phenomenon was occurring?
Right. So, Chris, as you know, I figured people would say this can't be true. There's no way that simply being identified as Black could have some biological consequence, right? And again, it has that biological consequence, I think, because of the nature of our society and its racist orientations and institutions and history and white supremacy and anti-Blackness. But then I said, okay, well, let me go systematically and think, what would theory say? So the first thing theory would say is this is not about race. This is about SES. And the theories in sociology that we label called fundamental causation, it says basically SES is the huge determinant of people's health.
And when you say SES, you mean?
Socioeconomic status, right? And this often comes from work that's been done abroad in Britain and other places. And I don't know if it translates well. We have some pieces that show that SES doesn't matter as much for Blacks as it does for whites in terms of their health outcomes. But anyway, so when I'm looking at fundamental causation, the idea would be to control for SES, socioeconomic status, and see if this relationship is attenuated between identity and health, right? And allostatic load. So you control for SES, guess what? Racial identity is still predictive of allostatic load in a harmful way. But then someone might say, well, you know, racial identity, we know there's complications to that with regard to skin color. And so there's a large literature on colorism, and there are people who write about the U.S. as a pigmentocracy, right? Our shading of skin color determines our experiences and how people respond to us, such that those who are more fair-skinned, closer to a European or white standard, are treated very different than those who are darker and more like a, say, African standard. So I control for skin color. Guess what? Racial identity is still predictive, still negative, right? So I said, well, there'll be other people who say racial identity, what you're really capturing is exposure to discrimination. And there's some literature that says people who have higher levels of racial identity are more sensitive to, more likely to see these things.
Sure.
So it's like, oh yeah, that what you found isn't real. If you had a measure of discrimination, it would absolutely go away. So I put the measure of discrimination in. Nothing changes. We still find a relationship between racial identity and higher levels of allostatic load. So then there was another hypothesis, and this is probably the most popular one, and it really resonates with your brilliant work, right, about the biomechanics and biomechanisms of stress exposure. So we have a stress exposure measure. I think there's 94 measures of self-reported stress, from traumas to everyday experiences. This is the leading measure of stress use in sociology, right? So I put that in. Guess what? Racial identity still matters.
Wow.
Now, I did this test that is in the paper that I'm writing, and maybe not in the presentation. I compared the coefficients for stress exposure to the coefficient for racial identity, because I wanted to know, are these significantly different? And what I find is that the coefficient for stress exposure predicting allostatic load, obviously it's a positive correlation,
Sure.
right? Is not significantly different than the correlation for racial identity predicted allostatic load.
Wow. So what you're saying there is the impact of self-reported racial identity on these physical health measures rivals an amalgamation of measures, just how stressed you are in sort of the broader sense. That's fascinating. It reminds me of some of the work we've done on child abuse and neglect and its association with physical health outcomes. So what we find time and time again with older adults in middle age, that people that retrospectively, there's good measures to show this isn't sort of a biased way of assessing child maltreatment, where you can really get at sort of objective indicators. It's prognostic of physical health outcomes over and above current depressive symptomology, right? Any socioeconomic status measure, health behaviors. Because immediately when you say that, they go, well, yeah, because they're more depressed when they're adults. They'll say, well, they've picked up more poor health behaviors along the way. But it seems to be something just deeply rooted in the system. And what I'm hearing here is that this racial identity measure is one of those measures that sort of transcends one's current mental health state. Do I have that right?
I think so. I think what it's saying is this may seem to be a social psychological variable, but really what it's capturing is something deeply structural that's important across the life course and across historical time.
And what about health behaviors, actually?
So
smoking, because I can imagine people saying, well, maybe this is associated with the context you're in.
Absolutely. So I figured I better do that because I know you and you're going to ask me this. So I had some health behaviors. I had things like smoking, exercise, sleep, because certainly that would explain whether you're sicker, and maybe there's some relationship between your identity and those things. Guess what? Racial identity is still predictive of higher levels of allostatic load.
Wow.
So at this point, I'm thinking I'm doing a really good job. I've looked at all these hypotheses. There's like 5 separately. But what if I do the gumbo hypothesis? What if I put it all in a pot and let it stir? So then I add all those things from SES to skin color to exposure to discrimination to the health behaviors. And guess what? Racial identity is still predictive of higher levels of allostatic load. So how I identify predicts my biological dysregulation on a molecular and cellular level, at a system level, over and above all these other things that anybody who's aware of the social determinants of health literature would think we should control for.
Oh, it's fascinating. And at one level, I definitely can see people bringing up all these third variable influences and still sort of implicitly, if not, outwardly saying it, thinking to themselves, it's got to be something we're not measuring. But when I think about it more from the perspective of a psychologist, whatever sort of makes up one's core sense of self drives everything, right? And I could imagine, especially in a racist society like ours, what could be more core,
Right. So this is why the paper is also deeply disturbing, because I'm not going to write a policy section that says, hey, Black people, stop digging your Blackness.
Yeah.
But on another level, hey, Black people, if you're digging your Blackness and given everything that's happening in the world, you're internalizing these attacks on DEI. You're watching people take down monuments and rename things, and you're wondering how in the world could people not think that slavery is significant?
Yeah.
Well, if you stay on that track, that train leads to probably premature death.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Let's instead of trying to dig into changing one's view of sort of the racial identity, what if we change the context? Now, I realize that this is more a thought experiment at this point, but I'm wondering if we were going to do a study in certain parts of the country versus others, or in certain parts of the world versus others, would the effects differ? Or do we live in such a global society now that no matter what sort of local policies and maybe context that one's in at a local level, no matter if they're more anti-racist, that doesn't overlay the fact that what you hear on the news every day.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You get what I'm saying?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question.
What you think about that.
And I like these thought experiments. So let's start at the micro level in the U.S. So there's work that I just read by a researcher at Ohio State University Department of Sociology. Golan, I think is her last name. It shows that people who attended HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, in later life have a lower probability of metabolic syndrome.
Interesting.
So when you think about context and changing context and what it all means, I think for some people, we have baked in the idea that for minorities, their way forward is to be in spaces that are integrated. But that also raises the probability that your identity could be conflicted in a very particular way, right? As you're trying to fit into multiple spaces. But if you could think about HBCUs at the micro level as a context where your identity is validated, everybody is there wants you to have a higher and more internalized racial identity. They value the history of struggle and resistance, and they want to bake that into you. Well, of course, by the time you're at midlife, you have lower levels of metabolic syndrome, likelihood of having that. So I think on that micro level, I think there are spaces. That's why we believe in the Black church so much. That's why we believe in certain kinds of what we call multicultural centers or Black centers. I think that's why a center like the Center for African and African American Studies on this campus is important, because it gives people a space to fit. So on a micro level, I think there are these spaces that matter where people can find comfort in being their authentic selves. In a Du Boisian term, they're not experiencing any two-ness. They're allowed to fully be their authentic self in these spaces. Sadly, on a micro level, those spaces don't exist everywhere. I tell people all the time, if there was a HBCU with the same resources as Rice, Tony Brown wouldn't be here. Right? Because I know. And then I'm watching things like Howard, right? Recruiting Ta-Nehisi Coates. Nicole Hannah-Jones, I think, is the person. All these people going to these spaces. So on a micro level, I see that. On a maybe meso level, there are countries where I think people are experiencing this kind of sense of Black authenticity and connection and identity, and it's kind of baked into who they are and how they see themselves. And maybe you see that in the Caribbean countries, whole countries where Blackness is not something we're going to devalue, because our whole country is Black.
Sure.
So we would see a very different kind of role. And I see it sometimes when the cultural traditions that have been stripped of people who are descendants of African slaves here in the U.S., right? Some of those cultural traditions are still alive in the Caribbean and other places. So you see that identity, racial identity being baked into who they are. So then on the macro level, the sad part is anti-Blackness is global. So could we do this same study in Australia with Aboriginal peoples? No question. Same thing in New Zealand, Aboriginal peoples? No question. I bet you we get the same finding in South Africa. So it feels as though as we unpack this, because anti-Blackness is global, there are very few places where someone who's strongly identified as a Black person feels welcome and empowered. In fact, you may even feel threatened.
Sure.
Right,
Absolutely.
by having a strong identity in certain countries. Right?
Sure.
So I don't know. As a thought experiment, it's really an interesting kind of thing, because I don't know that the world as a global system will become less anti-Black soon. However, we do see these spaces. We do see these spaces at the micro level, maybe at the meso level, and certainly I think we see some kind of movement. I think about the 60s, and I'm an old dude. So I was born in the 60s, 69.
Well, that's rounded.
But hey, 60s. I'm a 60s guy. But think about the
style's better in the 60s.
Yeah, the afros. As someone who's follically challenged, I wish I had an afro. There was a a Black power movement and a say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, right? So these moments in history when you can maybe sense a shift in anti-Blackness, and it's not always insignificant. It's sometimes really meaningful, and so those shifts could be also historical moments when we see maybe meso level changes and maybe even macro level changes. Australia recently issued a national apology for their treatment of Aboriginal people, right? And tried to think about what reparations was going to look like. I think those are kind of bigger changes that put us in a position to deal with the fact that anti-Blackness is global.
Yeah.
And there aren't many spaces that really allow, I think, people to feel comfortable in their skin and have resources.
Well, that resources matter a ton on top of any kind of individual level perception, right? But I think the fact that that even beyond resources is kind of what you're saying with the SES in a way. You still find these effects are fascinating. Have sort of two different follow-ups based on what you're articulating there. And I think I'll start with the HBCU example. Do you think there's something core about the developmental period that one attends in HBCU that can sort of inoculate wouldn't be the right word, but sort of sets a foundation in a different way? So in a broader sense, what I'm asking about this question is that if we live in a racist society and change is slow, if there's developmental periods where one can, I don't want to say get out of it because it's not the right term, but the context shift in a way where one can have genuinely pride and feel very safe. If that in a way could provide a secure base to kind of develop in a way where you might not see these negative effects. It's not the solution. The solution is at the broader level. But I'm trying to understand if there's sort of developmental periods that could have a disproportionate impact on people. And if one of the beauties of HBCUs is they really take people in one of those emerging adulthood periods.
That's a great question. And I want to say to you that the word inoculate is correct.
Okay.
It's like a vaccination against anti-Blackness and white supremacy, right? It's being in a space where you can exhale.
Sure.
Where your blood pressure isn't always high.
Yeah.
Where when Trayvon Martin is killed, everybody's on the same accord.
Yeah.
When there's something horrible that happens, you feel like you have a family, right? I think inoculate is the right word, but it's tricky because HBCUs are underfunded. We use state budgets to support larger schools that are white, and we're opposed to segregation. So it's a very fascinating kind of thing to think about these spaces because they feel like an anachronism. For many whites, I'm imagining, like, why do we even need those anymore? So it's a very weird thing because I do think it inoculates. And I think you're right. And your colleagues, Miller and Chin, I think that was the first time I was reading about these kind of delicate periods or sensitive periods and what happens to you, and even Ken Ferraro's work. I think right as you're developing, we can go back to Erickson, right? You're in these stages of developing your identity, and now we put you in this place. I've been to a lot of HBCUs, and they're all very different, and yet they're exactly the same. There's this huge range of Blackness. There's people who are African immigrants. There are people who are upper middle class Black people. There are people whose parents feel like they've realized their greatest dream because their child is at college and they had not ever had a chance to go. So you got that whole thing, all this variation, and yet everybody's on the same page. So I do think it inoculates. It allows you to see yourself as valuable and important in a developmental period when you're sensitive to the kinds of ways in which the world views you.
It makes a lot of sense to me. In psychology, there's a lot of work on this sort of idea of early attachment security, right? And the idea is that if, and this is much earlier than college, but the notion of attachment security is that at an early age, if you have a secure bond, right, with a caregiver that provides love and support and is responsive, it gives you what we would call a working model to deal with all those stressors that life has later in a healthier way, both mentally and physically. Shown, cross-culturally, and people that take it, from an intro psych book will recognize those terms. And when I think about that, we're not saying that someone should have a warm caregiver by their side for the rest of their life. That's not what we're saying. By just the opposite. The idea is that by providing that secure base, that model of security, you're able to grow one's sense of self to then deal with all that life has. I'm wondering if there's a parallel here. It's a different developmental stage, right? But I'm wondering if there's a parallel, and if there is a parallel, those that don't understand the value of things like HBCUs and think of it in terms of, well, that's segregation, can see that we're not saying that we're inoculating by providing that because we live in a racist society. And then what emerges from that is a more confident, healthy, secure self. I'm just thinking on the fly here, and I can argue against what I just said in 5,000 different ways from a developmental, just the age, but I wonder if there's something there. Because what I'm trying to get at here is not so much the value of things like HBCUs makes complete sense. How do we also articulate why that's so valuable and it's not segregation?
Wow, that's like the $1 million question, right? And your analogy is spot on. I like that analogy. But we're now in a space where we're tearing down multicultural centers. So, the analogy makes great sense if we could convey it to people. And I think we tried to convey it to people. But look at the budget lines for HBCUs. People don't believe in them, right? Mm-hmm. And yet, I think like a number like 67% of black lawyers went to HBCUs.
Wow.
86% of judges went to HBCUs. I think it's like 73% of engineers.
That's incredible.
HBC. So they're overperforming, underfunded, and then on a political level, sociopolitically, they're not valued because we think they don't represent our best values. Mm-hmm. So let's go back to your analogy, though. This idea that you have these periods of priming, right? You can think about like the Barker hypothesis, imprinting, right? And so I think two things about attachment theory. By the way, I like attachment theory. I think I'm a weird one. I'm like probably avoiding attachment.
I think I am too.
Okay. So at least, great podcast mates. Because we're the same person. Anyway, those theories to me are important because they speak to some fundamental human characteristics and needs and how they get met and why they're important long term. If I were thinking about attachment theory in a slightly different way, I'd want to add to the analogy and say that black parents have to do a little bit more, right? So I study race socialization, one of the ways in which parents teach their kids how to be black, how to understand their blackness. And in some ways, the attachment part it almost can't be colorblind. Because I only have to teach you to be attached to me. I have to teach you to be attached to your blackness because I know that's probably the thing that's going to carry you through life. So I think we have to begin to think about maybe culturally specific ways of thinking about attachment. But I think the analogy makes good sense. Now, could we use it as a strategy to argue we need like multicultural centers? We need centers for African and African American studies. I think we can. I think we can maybe do that. I think the problem becomes many of these spaces are subspaces in larger white spaces.
Yes.
Right? So how do we make an argument we actually need to give a ton of money to HBCUs and allow them not to have to create spaces, but allow the whole space to be receptive and warm to whoever could be there. So I think an analogy to attachment theory works great. I think the idea that they're fundamental needs that humans all have to meet or have to make and understand makes good sense to me. I would add that probably we need to think about how anti-Blackness in a global sense, but also locally in the micro level, macro level, transforms the nature of attachment. I think about it like this. One way to make it really clear to you. George Floyd had a daughter. His daughter probably had a strong attachment to him. There's a way in which if we don't process how racism is porous, right? Racism is permeable. It gets into everything. Then we maybe miss the idea that there's some universal things that have to happen for everybody. We miss that because we realize that everybody's not everybody. And there's certain kinds of nuances that we need to bring into the conversation. And there's certain kinds of experiences that we have to kind of unpack. I wrote about recently Emmett Till. And just imagine being a parent, seeing that cover of Jet magazine and brutalized and bullet-ridden and decimated body and corpse of this young 14-year-old, right? At that moment, every Black parent has to change how they think about attachment.
Sure.
We can't do it anymore the way we used to do it. Or just let's go even further back. What does attachment mean if you're a slave on a plantation? When your child's not even your child. So I think some theories are great and they're grand and they make sense, but they're generally ahistorical and colorblind.
Sure.
And maybe miss the idea that universal things work universally poorly, most cases, right? And even talking about HBCUs, if we're talking about systems of college, some of them, some reason we see attrition rates that are so high for students of color is microaggressions, the things that would happen on a primarily white campus that wouldn't happen someplace else.
Sure.
So universal solutions may not get us where we want to be. We'd need theory. And you and I talk about this, right? The value of theory. Imagine we could reimagine what attachment theory looks like for families now that are facing the deportation regime. Right? I just read a story about a woman who gave birth and her child came prematurely, was in the NICU, and she was rounded up by ICE enforcement. And this was someone who was trying to bond with her baby, skin-to-skin contact, even though the baby was in the NICU. And this woman was detained for 3 or 4 days, right? Had a C-section, could prove that this was a baby. So I think when we start thinking about processes and we allow inequality, structural inequality, to change how we understand that process, I think we get to maybe a better place. So imagine we could think theoretically about what it means to grow up now in a space of a deportation regime. That could be really powerful.
No, I agree. Speaking of theory, vicarious victimization.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that?
Yeah, I can unpack it. It's a bit painful to do it. So because of racial identity, and because I have a high level of centrality, I feel connected to my Blackness. I feel like it's an important part of who I am. It's a central part of my core self. When I see things happen to other Black people, it feels like it happens to me. And then it's not just a contemporaneous thing. So I think what's fascinating about some research is it acts like I'm going to study the lifespan of this individual. But if you think about the social psychology of linked lives and the ways in which my life is connected to someone else's, and we look at these intergenerational things, right? It becomes clear to me that even things that happen to people I don't know, and they happen in a different generation. So I use the example of Emmett Till. If I had a son and he's 14, I have a daughter and she's 14. If I had a son who's 14, I don't know Emmett Till, I don't know his family. But it changes how you have to parent and think about. Or Tamir Rice, right? He's playing with a gun at a park. He's got 2 seconds. So you might say, and this is one fundamental problem with stress exposure literature, the stress process literature, it's very egocentric. What happened to you?
Yeah.
What happened to you? But if you have a worldview that allows you to be a part of something bigger, it's like what happened to us.
Absolutely.
And so as long as the stress literature is egocentric, we're missing all of the ways in which our connections to other people matter. So I gave you the example of the woman who was detained after giving birth. I mean, just think about everybody else who's pregnant in that moment who reads that story.
Oh, yeah.
Right. It's us. It's not just me. It's us. And so you begin to think about how stress gets under the skin and into the body because of things that happen to other people.
Sure. Because you're interpreting it.
It could have been me.
Could have been you. I mean,
or it looked like
sense.
My cousin. One of the most disturbing things that happened, oh, gosh. I have a nephew, and shout out to Preston. And he just graduated from college. Shout out to Preston.
Congrats, Preston.
And he wants to be a fireman. Congratulations. Shout out to Preston.
I wanted to be when I was a kid.
When Tamir Rice was killed, his mom called and said, he looks just like him, right? So that hits in a certain kind of way. It's oh, wow, that literally his mom is saying that looks just like him, right? Just looks just like him. That's a hard thing to process, right? Because you don't know that it couldn't have been him, and that just reinforces it, and you realize how delicate your life is. So, it goes back to your question in a certain way about attachment, right? We want to raise healthy kids. We want to give them what they need when they need it. We want to have, the monkey with the fur on it, not the metal monkey. We want to give them what they need. But I think because of anti-Blackness, you can't protect them.
Sure.
Right? And so the idea that you can't protect your own kids, that changes what attachment means. But the idea that also you can't protect yourself.
Sure.
I've had encounters with the police where I thought, this is pretty much it. I remember one time I was home from college. I'm a college student. I think I had a pretty good average. My mom let me borrow the car. I went to see a friend, and I drove through my neighborhood, which was a disadvantaged, drug-infested neighborhood, and everybody knew me, and so it was no big problem. But I ended up driving right into the middle of a sting.
Wow.
There were like 20 cops, and everybody was pulling out their gun, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm not going to get back to sophomore year. So it changes you in a certain kind of way, because it's not just this is happening to us. You also then play your own personal experiences through this. And that's why vicarious victimization makes sense, because it's not some abstract thing.
Sure.
You also can relate back to your own personal experiences. And then when you have uncles or grandfathers, fathers who say, I was called boy when I was grown man.
Yeah.
Right? It embeds it. There's an embedded way in which this is embodied too. So I've been working on some of these things. Vicarious victimization is interesting because it led me to think about racial trauma, and I've been trying to think more carefully about that. And there's this reading that talk about how these things get in our subconscious, and they're there. They just sit there, they unsettle us.
Yeah.
In very particular kinds of ways. And now with social media, the horror of social media, right? I remember being asleep and my phone is dinging and someone's sending me a video that was maybe 20 minutes old of Alton Sterling being held down and shot in front of a store, right? And it's just like, I get it now. It's always there. I can't undo it. So it just makes vicarious victimization even more powerful, but it also spreads racial trauma in a way that was impossible before social media. It's hard to think about vicarious victimization and racial trauma and raising kids who have a normal attachment when they could see and access so much so quickly.
The concept itself seems so central to why some of these effects would occur, even if they didn't happen directly to oneself. And how many times have you heard, well, that didn't happen to you, right? That's a very, it's gotten better, that didn't happen to you. But it is happening to you because the brain doesn't know the difference. Your stress response doesn't know the difference connected to it in a fundamental way. And I think if people understood that more broadly, they might get a better appreciation. The closest thing I can think of off the top of my head for someone that is white is you mentioned when you have your kids at a certain age, right? If I see a child, I have a daughter, two daughters, something happened on the news, a missing child or whatnot, at the age,
Oh my God.
it tears you apart, right?
Oh my gosh. I used to look at milk cartons with the missing kids and be
Absolutely.
like, then I became a parent. I was like, oh,
but
crap.
The frequency with which the experience occurs in certain parts of our society,
Right.
It's dramatically different.
Exactly.
Do you think that do you think that is a mediator of the results that you found? When I say a mediator, one of the major sort of explanatory variables is of why we're seeing these effects is that people they're basically connecting to these events more.
I think
Going back to your study,
the salience of the events could absolutely be a part of it. I think there's probably a omitted variable I need, like how often are you exposed to these things on social media? How often do you see stories where Black people are traumatized? I think that could be something I would absolutely want to include. I don't know, though, if it diminishes the idea, though. In some ways...
Well, I wouldn't think it diminishes. I think
it would make it stronger. So
yeah.
Maybe it's a suppression effect. You add it and the effect of racial identity gets even bigger. That's very much possible. I think that's very much possible. So it could be that it's the vicarious stuff that does it for you. But more than likely, I think it's the intersection. Mm-hmm. It happened to you, and now you're watching it happen to somebody else. Yeah. So you know how you felt. I know how I never will forget pulling my mom's car into that intersection and watching 20 cops just pop out of nowhere. I'll never forget that feeling. Wondering if this is my last moment, sure. Right? And then I see... George Zimmerman do what he does. And it's like, yeah, I think it's the combination. But it's an empirical question. It could certainly be for certain people. Having these kinds of things happen to others really matters to you. And we might make a gendered hypothesis, given the cost of caring for women. Seeing these things happen to people means more because of their the ways in which they're connected. Men, it may be less. I will say one thing that's fascinating is I do work on discrimination, as you know. I have a measure that's in 2 data sets. And Chris, now I'm telling on myself. And I need to write that paper too. I haven't written. But I asked, when was the first time you've been exposed to discrimination?
Okay.
There are people in this survey who say birth. And then there are people who say age 75.
No kidding.
Like they made it 75 years before something bad has happened to them. In terms of health profile, the longer you work, the worse.
Sure.
And it's weird because you would think, well, wait, you've avoided it for all this time, but what you've not developed is the capacity to cope with it, appreciate it, systematically make a cognitive schema that allows you to understand how these things all fit together because you're not seeing it repeatedly. You somehow avoided this. And maybe you made it that far in life thinking race doesn't matter. Then you're 75 and you've been treated poorly and you think to yourself, what did I do wrong? How did I miss this my whole life? So
you don't have the armor.
So it's terrible, right?
Yeah.
The armor comes, and this is what I like about resilience. Speaking of the Institute for Health, Resilience, and Innovation, plug. For Black people, the hard life builds the armor. But the hard life destroys what's under the armor.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to live sicker and die younger to have a higher quality life. That's a trade-off that doesn't feel fair. That's like some kind of psychological fascism where you have to conform, right? And you're not conforming to this. You're in this space. You don't fit. You're always experiencing the Du Boisian two-ness. You end up in a space where you can't win. This was a difficulty for me. I remember when my daughter, Donald Trump was elected the first time. 2016. Daughter comes home and she's in the school, and you know how girls are, and all kids are. They go to these good schools that tell them bullying is bad. Yeah. She comes home and gets in the car. I'm picking her up from school. And she's like, I heard Donald Trump won. You want to talk about it? Yeah, I heard. Well, you told me bullies were bad, and I hear that at school. Yeah. Doesn't he bully people? And I'm thinking, yeah, this is a conversation for your mom. Let's wait till we get home. Ask your mom these kinds of questions. I don't know. It's messy, because if I raise a fully identified Black girl who's attached to her community, herself, her core, her history, her struggles, the struggles before, the Fannie Lou Hamers, the Sojourner Truth, right? She's connected to these people. I'm also setting her up to hurt when DEI is abolished, when we don't do certain kinds of things that really matter, when we eradicate a safety net, when we eliminate access to health care, knowing differentially and disproportionately that's going to impact people who look like her. What have I done as a parent? I tell people.
It sounds like a real conundrum. And what your study is saying is that you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, right?
You're digging Blackness and your grave.
Sure.
And the solution is not at the individual level. Mm-hmm. There's nothing I can redo. We have to find more spaces that affirm her for who she is, more spaces that affirm me for who I am, and allow resources to flow into those spaces. And then we need to clean up the spaces. You and I went on an environmental racism tour. Mm-hmm. If your understanding of, in the Fifth Ward, if your understanding of the value historically of the Fifth Ward is something that is powerful because it resonates with people who've come from nothing, made something of themselves, and moved forward, then how could we let the Fifth Ward be a place where folks can live literally directly across the street from a contamination site?
It's amazing.
So it's not, we could create the ideological spaces. Absolutely. We also need to create the physical spaces where people could be safe. And I think safe to be who they are and preserve their spaces and allow them to preserve the history in those spaces too. And then maybe you're less damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because at least in some spaces, that identity pays dividends. That identity connects you to people. As I've gotten older, I've thought more and more about the value of social connections. Mm-hmm. And racial identity gives me these incredible social connections.
You sure?
People I hardly know, I walk up to and we immediately know each other.
Sure.
There's something valuable in that. And I wouldn't want to take that away. But at the same time, I love to be a parent who could think about universal things that made my daughter healthy and happy without having to infuse those with some content and some practices that are aware of racism, anti-Blackness, and white supremacy. I can't just socialize her to be a young woman. I have to socialize her to be a Black young woman. So I have to bring that into it. So the damned if you do, damned if you don't, I think that's absolutely why this study is powerful and why I need to write it. But it's also proof that if we keep doing downstream things, if we keep treating people in London for cholera in 1854 and never actually go to the Broad Street pump and turn off the source of the cholera infection, then all we're going to do is do tertiary interventions that ultimately leave people living sicker and dying younger and have a basically tertiary system that's overflowing with people who are sick, who we can't help, who've already experienced the adversity, whose life quality is reduced, whose activity of daily living is already reduced. But the effort to shut off a pump at Broad Street, that's the start of cholera, that's much less effort than treating all these patients at the back end or doing all this research on the back end of how to help someone manage something that has already happened to them. So I think a part of the damned if you do, damned if you don't take home is let's not fix the people. Let's stop having interventions that are about fixing people, because ultimately that's victim blaming. Let's not try to change how you see inequality. Let's change inequality.
Sure.
Let's go upstream. Let's go to the Broad Street pump and let's turn it off, because that's the source of the problem. So how we turn it off, I don't know. We start thinking about things that are small but so significant. I work with a student at Vanderbilt who was into critical literacy, and she's now a principal at a school there. Critical literacy is when the books have characters who look like you, and their names are yours, right? So those are small things that allow you to see yourself as valuable early on.
I think that is so powerful, because if you can't connect to these stories all growing up, it's the other, it's not you. I'm curious, you're a sociologist, and you were a sociologist before you were a father.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how, because what I've noticed, part of parenting is dealing with some, especially if you have certain, regardless of your political briefs, but I can tell you there's always some cognitive dissonance between what you want for your child or what you're teaching your child, but what you really want society to do, right? And I'm curious, coming from being a sociologist and then becoming a parent, how you how that's changed the way you think about things, or has it not changed the way you think about things, but you kind of have to somehow create a separation between what should be done and at the contextual level, but what you have to do on this individual level with your child to get them through?
That's an amazing question. I was just telling Ann earlier, parenthood is the most amazing thing ever, because it forces you to put on a pair of glasses, and now you can't see the world in the same way anymore. Mm-hmm. It's totally different. So as a parent as a social scientist and generally a scholar of racism, anti-blackness, and white supremacy, I understood what the world was. And then she was born, and I realized I have to somehow put those two things together. So on the individual level, I tell my daughter, I want you to be president of the United States. As a sociologist, I recognize that gender is probably one of the most powerful stratifying forces in the world, and the likelihood of any woman ever earning the presidency is very low. So I have to balance those two things. So I find myself sometimes encouraging her to be cautiously hopeful. So I put them together. This was a great milestone. Look how far these women who've run for president in your lifetime have come. But they didn't make it, probably in part because they were women. So I have to put those two things together, and it's heart-wrenching. I've been told as a parent, our job is to tell our kids they can do anything they want to do, and then give them the resources to try to do whatever they want to do. Give them no barriers. One of the greatest lessons I learned was from my neighbor, Chris. Shout out to Chris. He moved. And Natasha. But they had a son, and he was amazing. He was gifted and talented, greatest athlete. He had beautiful hair. He was just, as like a 7-year-old, he was like the epitome of everything wonderful. And he was sometimes a little snotty, sometimes a little mean. And he was mean to my daughter once. And his mother was so appalled by this. He was like, we raised him differently, da-da-da-da. And yeah, oh my gosh, I can't believe you did it. Please apologize, Henry, to Brooklyn. And so Henry apologized reluctantly. And then his dad came out, Chris comes out, and Chris says, what happened? I heard this noise. Well, and Natasha says to Chris, well, Henry is misbehaving. He's acting like he's blah, blah, blah. And Chris goes, hey, Henry, cut it out. And then Natasha says, that's all you're going to say? And this was one of those parenting lessons that hit me so hard, I almost had to go in the house and process it. Natasha says, is that all you're going to say? And Chris's response was, as a parent, our job is to build them up because the world will knock them down. And I was like, holy smokes. That first breakup, those rejections from the colleges you wanted to go into, maybe a chronic illness, certainly the loss of your parent.
Sure.
The world's going to bring this
again,
and so you want to just give them everything they can. Let them go out there with maybe an ego that's a little bit too big, because it's going to get chipped down the sides really quickly. But then I'm sitting back saying to myself, that works for white parents, doesn't it? If I tell my daughter to be assertive, now she's an angry black woman. If I tell my son stand up for your rights, and he stands up when he's pulled over by the police. So it becomes a very complicated way of managing these things that are structural at the individual level by still trying to maintain, I think, the best principles of parenting, which is build them up, give them everything they need, and see what happens.
Reminds me of sort of this idea of goodness of fit, like what works in one context doesn't work so much in another. Now, a lot of those theories are actually based on parenting behaviors within a family, but what you just articulated there makes a ton of sense, right? It's a different thing, right? Depending on gender and race and that
class too,
and class, right?
Yeah, but does that make us bad parents? I sometimes wonder.
Yeah. It's tough. I remember the first time my daughter became aware that there's never been a woman president of the United States. I'm not joking when I say, we're not talking like she was in hysterics, but this hit her for a week. She was about 11. I think she was 11. Just wasn't aware. She was probably like 9 now that I think about it. It still brings it up. And now my younger one brings it up. It's so perplexing to them, right? About because they're at an age right now where either they don't see those differences or they play out differently on the playground, So it's even hard to wrap your head around why later on that happens.
Right.
I wonder if there's things like that occur with race as well.
Absolutely.
Here's a parallel that I have with that. My youngest daughters, her 2 best friends in school were black. She kind of didn't realize they were, that just never even occurred to her. And I can't speak for them, but it just wasn't on the plate, it wasn't a thing. Like, you almost had to make you aware, right? That's going to change throughout one's life.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering as a parent if you've how you sort of navigated that sort of as they develop into teenagers, knowing this is coming, and hopefully when they were younger, it wasn't like that.
Yeah, what's interesting is we talked about the degree to which racism is just kind of malignant. It spreads in all the pores and cracks and crevices. So there's a book called Reading, Writing, and Racism. It's about kindergartners and race on the Schoolyard by Amanda Lewis. And what you find is that even in these situations when race doesn't matter, for some black kids and kids of color, they're being told things in kindergarten that make no sense. Like, they're coloring the astronaut black,
Sure.
and the kid next to them is saying astronauts can't be black.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that has already started to seep in, and then you see how the friendship networks work. But the book that really made me think about these things different, and this is before I was a dad, was Beverly Tatum's While the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, right? It was about, at that moment in your life course, the black kids need a black table, right? It doesn't matter if you think it's a bad thing. It doesn't matter. They need that black table in order to go back, right, and do something. So I think I think they're constantly aware of it, maybe more aware of it than their counterparts who aren't racial minorities, of how much race matters. They're also aware of it because it's really obvious even in that space. You go to school, and why are there no black men teachers?
Mm-hmm.
Why are most of the teachers women and often white? So you're already seeing the authority of the world dictated. So it's a very fascinating kind of moment to think that it develops later for them, when I think really it develops early on.
That brings me to the thought I was actually going to inquire, and I know we don't know with these individual kids, but I wondered if she wasn't aware, but they were aware, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't know. Another example, this all kind of happened at the same time. Her pediatrician's black. She never thought about it, right? I wonder if her friend, if she went to the same pediatrician, would think about it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think it's what I'm implying in some ways, that privilege of not thinking about it is very different than the disadvantage of always having to be sensitive about it. Kids will be kids. One time my daughter pushed the kid at the lunch table and his pizza fell on his pants, and his uniform pants. And so the kid's upset. I'm like, hey, you can't do this. We can't horseplay at lunch. And so the parent contacts me and says, I'm really upset. Your kid puts the pizza onto my kid. And I say, my kid was in the wrong. I'm going to take her allowance away this week. And we will either get the pants dry cleaned or we'll get the pants replaced. And this parent says to me, this woman, this mother says, wow, I just didn't think you would do that. Now, what was weird about it was the way she said it. I read it as, wow, black people have the same kind of way of raising their kids as white people. And I was like, yes, of course, my kid made a mistake. She has to fix the mistake. But I remember at that point, although our kids might not be aware,
yes,
the parents are intensely like, oh, how long will this last? What's this interaction look like? And we know from research on the prison pipeline, there's different levels of, I guess you would say, deviance that's allowed, right? Mm-hmm. There's some kids who immediately experience school suspension for certain behaviors, and other behaviors are allowed to go on. So, I think the parents are aware of it, and it certainly kind of hits home for them. But I think even the kids are aware of it. And it's hard now, I think, all the things that are swirling in the world to avoid this. And maybe the parents are doing a good job. Sounds like you're doing a great job, right? Where you're just saying, hey, meet people where they are. The stuff on the outside doesn't matter. Hang out with who you want to hang out with. But then you get to that dating age. You get to what Beverly talks about, and all of a sudden, now we got the black table, and all of a sudden we need that, and that means something different, and how we think about these interactions. Once we get to that early teen, maybe mid-teen thing, changes so much, because now the parents who were so willing to accept the play date when you're 3 are now not so willing to think that your prom date might not be the same race as you.
Does that play out? I'm guessing it does.
Yeah, I think it does.
It actually makes me think about sort of the development, if you're trying to raise a white kid, to be anti-racist, right? Because what the example of my daughter, what she's really talking about is like a color blindness, which is not what you want to raise I wouldn't want her to have that worldview as an adult.
Right.
That doesn't do anyone any good.
Right.
Right. I would say it probably has done more harm than a lot of things. Now, when is a parent to shift that, right? Do you say it in 8, like, it's hard, right? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. So the literature on race socialization is really clear. Sooner is better than later, and sooner sometimes is subtle. These books that have different characters, these kid books, those books signal something to people. Trips to certain libraries. There's a book on race and place, and it suggests that sometimes it's the museums you go to. It's the things you do take the kid to where they see difference, right? Those things is never too soon to do those, because the other thing we see is that infants, there's work that's disturbing. I'm not sure how to make sense of it. 6-month-olds respond to people who are different races differently in terms of the amount of time they spend looking at them. They look at the person who's dissimilar more. So does that mean my 6-year-old knows there's a 6-month-old knows there's a difference? And if so, then my ability to start thinking about how to talk about these things matters. But I also think sometimes it's the things we do without doing anything. So who we invite over for dinner, where we go to shop, who we strike up a conversation with in the line while we're waiting to check out at the grocery store. That's the worst part about being a parent. Your kid is always watching you. So you got to be on your P's and Q's.
Yeah.
And, sadly, I have used profanity and discovered how quickly your kids can also mimic some things you say. So it's like, oh, well, you got to be careful with that. But you also need to be intentional with the other things too, right? The things that allow your kid to see that you think it's okay behaviorally without even saying anything.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And man, they're always watching.
Yes.
And it feels so bad because when I hear my oldest use some choice words, I know where she got this. I want to go to a quote you have from James Baldwin.
Oh, gosh. Wow.
Do you know what I'm talking about here?
I know. Yeah.
Okay. It says, to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. Do you believe this rage is embedded with this sort of physiological arousal, and that you're seeing this sort of heightened arousal get under the skin because of living moment by moment a moment with those awareness?
Absolutely. You know, and I know when we talk about emotions, rage is a destructive one.
Yeah.
And people who've internalized this rage, and they internalize it because they feel some sense of righteous indignation. How is it that we can minimize the significance of slavery when we never addressed its significance to begin with? How can we take the names of war heroes who happen to be Black off of military bases, or off of, it just feels like you're constantly in the state of wanting to fix the world, but knowing you can't, and then hoping that more people see that there's value in your humanity. So it feels like, I think James Baldwin was right, and James Baldwin left the United States for that reason. You know, he was watching Jim Crow and the end of Jim Crow, thinking to himself, having grown up in Jim Crow, you can't be creative in this space. I remember a quote, he said, how can I write a novel if I'm seeing these kinds of things day to day happen in the world? And so I do think rage is a big part of it. And sadly, I think resignation becomes a big part too. So as you age out, you realize you've done so much, or you tried to do so much. And what's really changed? You start thinking to yourself, what was the value of being angry to try to be motivated to do something when you could see parallels between historical events that showed that Black lives don't matter consistently over time. So I think the rage is a problem.
Sure.
I also think the rage is required.
Of course.
So now we're back to
now
we're back to the damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Well, it's such a motivating force. You know, in the basic work in neuroimmunology, where kind of one of the spaces that I work in, there's been a lot of stuff on actually the type of marital relationships that impact people's physical health and the ones that don't. And what they find is that it's not you're yelling, the screaming, but when there is a hostility or a rage, that emotion, right? And they use it in the dyad, but it could be anywhere. Right. That emotion seems to have a unique impact versus other negative emotions on the physiological system. Now, for that example, you know, you don't want to be highly hostile to your spouse, but let's just extract that for a minute, because all emotions have their value in certain situations. Right. We just talked about one of them. But if the side effect is one of the most dangerous emotions, negative emotions, you could see how you're seeing these physical health repercussions so powerfully because it's been isolated. That is for some reason, that is the emotion. And you could theorize why that would really drive a quick blood pressure response.
Yeah, there was this work that was done in the 70s by Ernie Harburg. It was one of the first things I read when I was in grad school about skin color, darker men having higher blood pressure and darker skinned Black men having higher blood pressure. And they implicated rage, just being angry, right? Upset that you were mistreated, upset people you know were mistreated. But at the same time, right, maybe that's why maybe we saw the appeal of the nonviolent protests, right? But now people are looking at that wondering, maybe that wasn't enough.
Yeah.
Right? That we needed more rage. We needed as much SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coalition, right? As much as we did the Black Panthers.
Sure.
Right? We needed both sides of it. But the rage it feels intergenerational. Right? I remember clearly my grandfather telling me I was called a boy as long as I can remember. Right? That was toward the level of resignation toward the end of his life, but it made me angry.
Of course.
Right? So I'm now it's like he gave me that rage to carry.
Sure. I mean, how can you not, that sort of injustice that you're carrying with you at all times.
Which is again, so this goes back to how we think about health disparities, right? If we're only thinking about the things that happen in my life course to me and not contextualizing them in the things that have happened two people like me, my family and other people, in the vicarious way or in the way in which that's global around anti-Blackness, I mean, I think we're missing some part of stress exposure that is really important
Sure.
for thinking through by having more of a universal approach to thinking about the kinds of things that impact us. I even think about your work on bereavement, and I think about the sets of men you're interviewing, right? If you're a Black man, probabilistically speaking, your wife will outlive you. So it's just a different kind of way in which bereavement hits for that sets of community if they get married, knowing they have the lowest rates of marriage, right?
Yeah.
Among any race by gender group. So thinking about the universal, but then making room for the structurally determined approach too, I think is really useful. But it goes back to rage. It goes back to those things because I can never be angry in public. Someone will call the police, right? And many Black women say as soon as you show up, you can't be the angry Black. Now you're the trope. So it's both individualized in the sense that what do I have access to in terms of an emotional repertoire, but also it's socialized in a way where I have to be really careful when I raise my voice to whom I raise my voice. One of my mentors, Rob Sellers, he's a very big guy and he studies racial centrality. And I remember the way he carried himself. I was like, this is so unusual because I'd see him backstage when he was Rob. But then he said, you just have to be really careful. When you're my size, how you move, what you say, how you say it. And I thought to myself, yeah, that's the kind of cognitive load.
Yes, exactly.
That you don't realize is a part of the disadvantage, right? And then that cognitive load makes you mad. Why do I have to do that? Right. So then there's a force multiplier on your rage.
Sure.
That ultimately makes you even angrier that you have to perform this way in order to be accepted in a space. So, yeah, I think Baldwin was on it.
It seems to me that the more almost effective you are, the more cognitive load you would have. Meaning, when I say effective, I mean effective in the sense of suppressing or whatever it is you're doing to not be genuine, right? That's going to be correlated with the toll that's going to have on the system. Yeah. You can only do that for so long.
Well, that's what I was thinking. And then I thought, well, maybe the best way to survive physically is to be colorblind. If you're Black, just to pretend it doesn't matter, it doesn't exist.
But you would lose your sense of self.
Damned if you do.
Yeah.
Damned if you don't.
So for listeners navigating these environments, what is the most important thing you want them to understand, and what gives you hope?
I appreciate that question. I want listeners who think about the work you're leading at the Institute for Health, Resilience, and Innovation, and the work we're doing in Community Core, the work Brian is doing around training, to think about research differently. I would love for research to be about humans and not human subjects. I want us to think more carefully about how our universal theories are fundamentally flawed. I want people to think about social determinants of health as being as important as personal lifestyle choices and even genetic history, whatever. I want folks to understand that if we want a healthier society, the types of changes we have to make have to be structural. We have to begin to think about the Broad Street pump and less about what I can do differently as an individual. If I live in a food desert, I don't know what I'm supposed to do to get access to healthy green food, right? Because I don't live near it. If I live in a space that's unsafe to walk in and there are no sidewalks, the notion that I should be more active is a very interesting kind of response. So I guess I want people to think about the structural things. I want them to think about what really matters. And I want them to think about how sometimes the situations people are in are not about individual differences. They're about things that they can't control. In some ways, that's what James Baldwin was talking about. He can't control his rage. It's being ignorant of these things would be better, but he can't be ignorant of those things. So that leads to his rage. And in some ways, the better research part of it, where we really focus on humans and not human subjects, means we're not going out to say, oh, I want to do this intervention on you. We're going out saying, what do you need, right? Or I want to try this thing out, this new scale I developed. Well, no, what do you need? How can we serve you? And I think if we have a different research model, I think science will be more respected. I think folks will see us as not being in our ivory towers running our experiments, but instead being centrally, compassionate about the durability of inequality and our role in undoing it. So I would love for research to be different. And that could be very specific. That could be the kinds of independent variables we choose. What if we have independent variables that map on to these structural things? Mm-hmm. Distance to creosote, right? Mm-hmm. What if we have those? Now all of a sudden we're starting to see research that speaks to people's lived experiences and is oriented toward upstream things, right? If we know this is the problem, how do we get ahead of it and fix it so we can do a little bit better? I think that's what I would like people to take away from this, that even though I'm talking about things like racial identity and allostatic load and discrimination, all these things that feel very individual level, they report at an individual level. The story I'm telling is biopsychosocial, but it really is about the structural and sociological forces that prevent people from being healthy, mm-hmm. that they can't control. But we have the apparatus, I think, as researchers to begin to uncover and debunk ideas that people are healthy or unhealthy because they choose to be that way. So I think that's what I want you to take away from this, that identity isn't a choice. You are who you are, and to disown your core self is not an option. So we need to create a space where racial identity does not become a pathogen.
That's really well said.
What am I hopeful about? God, there's so much. I'm hopeful because I'm working with you.
Very kind.
So I told you this a while ago. I mean, I feel like we're peanut butter and jelly. We should get together. We should do more. We should get this thing rolling. We should be able to translate what we know. And I said, you're obviously the nation's leading expert on thinking about the biomechanics of stress and how that works. And I'm probably one of the more smarter guys thinking about the structural kinds of things. What if we get together? I think that's nitroglycerin, peanut butter and jelly, champagne, and orange juice, mimosa. Let's make this thing. Let's get it moving. So I'm hopeful about that. I'm also hopeful about the fact that I think, remember we talked about armor and how these hard things, right, give you the armor. I'm hopeful because I think some of the structural and sociopolitical changes we're watching right now are waking people up. They're giving them this motivation. Let's go, Baldwin. They're making them rageful. Mm-hmm. They're angry now in a way they haven't been. And that might be the moment for us to think more carefully about our mission, about the mission statement of Rice, about the mission statement of the Institute, about our own personal mission statements. Because I've seen more people now be like, this is not what I want for my nation than I have ever seen before. Really? So I'm hopeful for that. I'm also hopeful that as the generation passes, my daughter doesn't have to choose.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
She doesn't have to choose between being black and dysregulation, right? She doesn't have to dig her grave in blackness. She could dig blackness without it digging her grave. So I'm hopeful that, incremental as it may be, seemingly insignificant sometimes. I've been called boy twice, but my grandfather was called boy all the time. Incrementally, we're moving in a direction that gives me some hope, because I think people who care are raging now. They're angry. They want something different. And I think community people are people who we have some responsibility to saying, what are you doing for us? I think that rage is spreading in a certain kind of way. So I'm hopeful for that. So I'm hopeful, I guess, for a better future.
Yeah. Well, thank you for walking us through the research that challenges comfortable assumptions. It puts us to think about racism and how it becomes biology and why these costs are not an individual failing, but a structural problem. For those listening that want to hear more about your work, where should they go?
They could certainly go to the RARE Work Group website. That's my lab at Rice University. RARE, RARE.rice.edu. They could also follow some of the work I'm doing on LinkedIn. And certainly the research I'm doing with you in the Community Core will be available through more podcasts and through outreach on social media that is probably #Institute for health resilience at Rice University.
Fantastic. Well, great. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate you.
This was amazing. And I got to tell you, just sitting here talking to you has been like the highlight of my year.
Well, you're very kind.
This is really good.
I really enjoyed it.
This is really good because I think sometimes people forget that we're people.
Yeah.
And our research comes from a place that is personal. And it's okay for our science and subjectivities to be exposed. And so you allowed me to be myself authentically. And in this space, I felt like I could. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time to be here. Look forward to many more collaborations.
Yeah, part 2 podcast.
Yeah.
Come on back.